Hello, wonderful nurses. So glad you're here for Unit 4 as we will begin our focus on qualitative research. Remember, qualitative research is always non-experimental in nature. You may find studies that have triangulation. Remember, that is where you have both quantitative and qualitative features in a study. But really, qualitative research designs are very, very different. Remember, there are no interventions. There's no manipulation. There's no control, no blinding, no comparisons of groups. And the beauty of qualitative research has to do with the settings, because usually they are in natural, real-life settings. And they may use time frames for these study designs that are similar to quantitative, but most often you're going to find that qualitative studies are retrospective. They look backwards and gather data. So, this is exciting information. I know it. Qualitative studies. They're fabulous. And there are 5 types of qualitative studies. Ethnography. This is really looking at culture and cultural behavior of people. And what happens with ethnography is that the researcher really gets out there. They are amongst the people, observing, interviewing, data collecting, spending lots and lots of time in the field and conducting field work. One of the things they focus on has to do certainly with the cultural words, actions, and products. But what are the norms for the people in the culture? What are the value systems that drive this culture? Those are the things the researcher is looking for in ethnography. And assumption is also a piece of that. And the qualitative researcher really aims to produce an in-depth, holistic portrait of this culture. And of course it's going to be based on some assumption. Phenomenology. These are great words to use over dinner tonight. But really, phenomenology examines human experiences. And they do this through description by the people living in it, living through something. It is the essence of the phenomena. For example, living through Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath, living through breast cancer diagnosis, just listening to people describe their world, being in the world of something, a phenomena. Now, the interesting thing with phenomenology is that the sample size is very, very small, but the volume of data you get, whoo, it is extensive. The sample size may be less than 10 people describing how they survived the aftermath of Katrina. But you will have tons of data, and we'll talk about why that's true momentarily. The third qualitative design is grounded theory. And this is looking for really that social, psychological problem that is defined by a group of people. And if you remember, in some earlier discussions, I had shared with you about the perceptions or the lived experience of the caregivers of the chronic mentally ill. And we used grounded theory in that because we were defining this group's experience. And with this grounded theory, you really collect the data first. You ask the questions, and then you analyze and develop a theory around it after the fact. It elucidates social, psychological processes and structures. Don't you love that word? Elucidates, to make known. And it does this by using inductive and deductive reasoning. Put a star by that. It's going to elucidate or make aware of these processes and structures by inductive and deductive reasoning. And you also have small sample sizes with grounded theory of around 20 to 40 respondents or participants. Now, historical design or historical research examines events of the past. And it is interpretive, and relationships are explored. And you're going to find these things in data. So the researcher will go back and look through documents, relics, artifacts, oral reports. I want you to know that Dr. Lofton's dissertation research was historical study on academic freedom in the United States. Be sure to ask her about that. I do want to point out to you that on page 268 in your text, table 14.1, there's really a great summary of these qualitative designs, and I do want you to focus on those because you do need to know them. There is another type of qualitative design, but it's kind of a lesser known, lesser level, perhaps, because it's a case study. You may only have one or two respondents or subjects, uber small sample, in-depth examination of a people or a group of people. For example, it might be the hospice care for a dying patient. And so you're going to use just a case study as part of this qualitative study. Again, it's going to be a description or an exploration. So remember, there are basically 5 types of qualitative research design. As we go into more exploratory description and elucidation of what that's about. Sampling. Now remember, qualitative sampling is different than quantitative. All of our samples, or our respondents, are volunteer. There is no probability sampling. There is no stratified random sample. It is because they are really volunteering to participate. And here are some things you do need to know. There's a convenience volunteer sampling, and we've already really discussed that because you find that also in quantitative studies. They are just there. So you have access to them, like all of you guys. UMMC RN to BSNs would be a convenient sample. The snowball sampling, this is the sample that grows. Let's say you have mothers of children with paranoid schizophrenia, and you're bringing them into a clinic for discussion. They may know other mothers through association or whatever that also have children with schizophrenia. So you may bring them in. So your sample actually grows by every contact you have. It's snowball. Think of it as rolling down the hill, gathering up mass. There's purposive sampling. That is, the target is really a typical case. For example, mothers of very low birth weight preterm babies. That's going to be a purposive sampling. Theoretical sampling is really most often used in grounded theory because the groups really are chosen because you need to develop further themes so that you can develop a theory. Isn't this good stuff? All right, so again, it's all volunteer. Now let's talk for a moment, if I can find my place here. This is a slide about the main qualitative traditions. Let me go first. Okay. This just gives you a little more detail about ethnography, types of qualitative research. You can see you may have 25 to 50 subjects in that pool. And it's really casting a big net. You're looking at the culture, if you remember correctly. All right. Data collection. I want to talk just a minute about data collection in qualitative studies, because the whole purpose is you're collecting this information, and what the goal is, and what you need to put a star by, is you want to gather enough data to saturate so that you're getting the same themes or the same sentence or structure is recurring every time you're asking questions in this qualitative study. You're getting repetition with no new data, and that is called data saturation. And that's when you know you have achieved all you really need to know. And then you can stop sampling, essentially. Also, you remember that the sample sizes are smaller. Most of the time, certainly going to be less than 25. Rarely will you see any qualitative research with 100 or more. And the reason for that is because the data collection for qualitative studies is voluminous. There are just tons and tons of transcripts and verbatim things. And so it takes a long time to filter through all that data. Now, there are some great tables on page 289 of your text regarding this data collection, so be sure to review that. But here's the skinny on some major differences or things. The data collection methods may change as the study progresses. It does, and it will. It evolves. As you start out with maybe 2 bridesmaids in a wedding and you end up with 10, well, the same thing happens in a qualitative study. You may start out with 1 to 2 respondents and you're asking a few questions. Well, you get in there and realize that, well, you need to know so much more about that sense of loss, of depersonalization for the caregiver of the chronically mentally ill patient. What does that mean to them? So that data collection progresses and evolves. In-depth interviews are the most common method for all of the qualitative studies. And these in-depth interviews can last, 1, 2, 3 hours. And observations are also common, but not as common as the in-depth interview. Now, page 290 really begins a detailed discussion regarding the types of self-report data for qualitative studies. And qualitative data, there's just so much more to it, as we've talked about. But there are ways and types of the qualitative self-report technique. There's the unstructured interview. It's very conversational, very flexible, and it's appropriate for these exploratory types of studies. So, what was it like for you after you experienced your heart attack? There again, these are usually long, lasting several hours, and it's kind of the grand tour questions, the very open-ended, so that you're getting your respondent to emote and fully disclose. Then you have the semi-structured interviews, and you're using a topic guide because you're asking the same questions in the same order, in the same manner of all respondents. And for this, you're usually having an interviewer that is trained so that you're not getting that Hawthorne effect or that difference of the interviewer bias or impact, because you want people to be asking these questions in the same manner. And this semi-structured interview is going to have both closed-ended and open-ended questions. You remember that closed-ended is yes or no responses. Open-ended is the why or the what happened next. These can be done face-to-face, over the phone, Skype, you name it, it can be done now. So these are the skinny on the self-report techniques. The other methods of self-report have to do with focus groups. You will not find focus groups in quantitative studies. But these are interviews in small groups, 5 to 10 people. Again, you've got the moderator that is trained up, like in the semi-structured interview, using a topic guide so that you keep people focused and you're getting the information. Diaries are also a powerful self-report, having people record what their thoughts are, and it's a great source of historical research. and it provides intimate detail of everyday life, like having the mothers of those very low preterm babies keep a diary, and then you reflect on that. Here are some more types of self-report techniques for qualitative studies. Critical incidents, and this is really focusing on something that is specific, a specific impact. Now these are used out there in qualitative studies, but not perhaps as often, just because there's this risky nature of note-taking for data accuracy. Because all of qualitative study, you've got this voluminous data, and you're looking at research records and transcribing and the attention to all the details, and then by George, somebody may have amnesia, one of the interviewers or the researchers, that may interfere. So you're going to see critical incident and photo elicitation, but not as often, but you may. And this is the critical incidents is just where they're looking at something about the moment that you recognized you were having a myocardial infarction. What happened at that time? Photo elicitation. That's where you show a photo and you have the respondent interpret or share their emotional or physical or psychological responses to that. So, boy, lots of types of qualitative self-report techniques, and this is how we gather the data for those qualitative studies. Now, there are qualitative observational methods that are specific. And, qualitative researchers are really just knee-deep with the subjects. They are inside the research. They are out amongst the people. They're not sitting back counting numbers and things. So when the observational methods are used, the researcher is right there in it. And this has to do with really participant observation, which is prolonged periods of social interaction between the researcher and the participant, so that you get to see repetitive behaviors along the way. Now, the researcher completely is immersed in the setting. And there are 4 key phases that Lineger's 4-phase sequence came up with. And I do want you to read this in your book to give a better flavor for how this researcher becomes immersed in the setting and with the participants. Because there are some problems, as you can see, if you're conducting qualitative research and you're looking at the culture, and all of a sudden you realize as a researcher that you're not really accepted into the culture. They're looking at you through guarded eyes, and there's no rapport. Well, what does that do to your data? Well, it's going to limit it. You've really, as a researcher conducting qualitative studies, you've got to account for that and try to make sure that you have an integration into the respondent's world. Don't you like that? Man, qualitative research have to think theoretically all the time. All right, so back to recording those wonderful observations. Remember, we had those self-reports, but these are when the researcher is recording the observations. The most common are going to be logs and field notes. You can use photos and videos too to record, and certainly now that we have cell phones and all those kinds of tools, you can use those. But field notes are going to be very powerful because this is really a detailed handwritten note with the researcher's impressions and inferences about what's out there, what the data is, what's happening. And then there's personal notes, and these are personal to the researcher, which is what the researcher thinks about it. It's beyond the impression of the inferences. It's kind of the so what. Now there's some great examples on page 295 of your text that really share about what those field notes and logs may look like, and I encourage you to look at those. As we move on then, from data collection for qualitative research, and to the analysis. Now remember, qualitative data does not use statistics. So there are tons of data to evaluate, and it's going to require the researcher to have organization, integration, and interpretation of this data to make sense of it and to make it trustworthy. Qualitative data is often collected sequentially, and it grows. So you start out small, and it does snowball. So then you've got all this data that you've got to condense into meaningful themes to really make sense of it, and it is a lot of work. So there are some challenges, as you might imagine, that are posed from that. And these are the challenges, is that there's really no universal rules. You just kind of try to take the big picture and make it narrow. Lots of intensive work and using inductive powers of reasoning. That is the key. Now, there are some analytic procedures for each type of qualitative research, and these can make your head spin. So this is really just an overview. Read for depth, but here's the other thing to know is when you get to actually conducting qualitative research, you can go back and certainly you'll have to get familiar with the processes. But just remember, really, that the data is collected through audio tapes and field notes generally. And what you're going to have is verbatim transcription is critical. And we're talking word for word. Even indicating the pauses and exclamations, laughter, crying are also included in the text. And sometimes you're going to see these in brackets in the left margin. And in the right margin, you may have the comments from the researcher that are really talking about the content. So there's going to be the themes or regularities or broad categories that you're going to see in the analytic overview when you're reading research. Now, what happens then is that the researcher wants to validate these themes and patterns. So the researcher reads the data with a proofing process and underlining key phrases. And that's just so that the point is really to transfer all of this raw data into meaningful pictures of the process. For example, mothering twins, a study about what that perspective was. And there are 4 key points. And so the researcher has to immerse themselves, dwell with the data, and then the data reduction. What are the key themes, the analysis, the so what of these key themes, and then the interpretation of those. So you may find some quasi-statistics in your qualitative studies that you're reading, but know that they're not generally going to be there. Now I want to talk just briefly, because I think this is a unique theme that is powerful and more dominant in your qualitative studies in the literature, called phenomenological analysis. And you're going to see these because remember that the phenomenological studies examine the human experience through the description of the people involved. And one of the ways this is interpreted is through Heideggerian hermeneutics. Heideggerian hermeneutics. Use that term at dinner tonight. Woo! It's a hoot, isn't it? And it is a major emphasis out there in the literature. And I want to tell you that this Diekelman that's listed here, Nancy Diekelman, is a well-known nurse researcher and theorist based on this Heideggerian hermeneutics. And it is a process, it's a circle where all the data moves, and even the researcher, their beliefs, assumptions are included. So part of the research process is the researchers themselves. Isn't that cool? So I do want you to know that phenomenological studies will have Heideggerian hermeneutics, and that Nancy Diegelman is a big player in that, and you're going to see that in a lot of the research studies noted. And that this Dr. Diegelman went on as a nurse theorist and researcher and developed a 7-stage approach that focuses the whole team on the validation of data. I'm not going to go into detail here, but just read this for reflection. An example might be in a study looking at brain death of a sibling. And then all of us would come together and we would look at that and interpret that data as a group. There's a team analysis that goes to that volume of data and the themes that emerge. Don't you like that? It is so cool. So, alrighty then. So that would be the data analysis. You're really going to see themes, and that saturation of data prevail. Now, moving on to chapter 17, as you might suspect, there are some controversies about the utility or the science of qualitative research. But I do want you to know it's a big fat hairy deal, because a majority of nursing research has been qualitative. And so now there has been a push in the last decade for nursing to really kind of move out and do more quantitative, or certainly more triangulated evidence-based practice research to make us a credible science. So here's some controversies that you just kind of need to know about. That the major dispute has to do about validity and rigor, and you can see that. Can you realistically apply rigor to qualitative data? Because it is the respondents and, to the researchers' extent, somewhat opinion or thought or inference about the data. And then how do you apply that data? There's some other controversies that really talk about no common vocabulary. The terms are interchangeable. They're different meanings or definitions that are really not congruent across people or cultures. For example, death. Goodness, death is valued, identified differently throughout. So what about that transferability of these study findings? If you get some kind of data from a qualitative study, how can you transfer it to other groups? So those are some of the major controversies. But you'll be happy to know that there are two individuals, Lincoln and Guba, that have really moved forward to come up with a gold standard for making qualitative research credible and using criteria. And your book does a good job of detailing those. But really, Lincoln and Guba developed these criteria to enhance trustworthiness and quality. So look at page 323 in your text for the details, and especially table 17.1, that really goes into detail about what makes that gold standard work. Because the point is that these criteria really are essential for quality data collection in qualitative studies. And here's kind of the skinny over that when you're conducting qualitative studies, you look at prolonged engagement. That's that repeated immersion and focus between the researcher and the respondents or the culture. Persistent observation. You're remaining focused on those salient, important points or data. Reflexivity, awareness of the individual researcher's effect, because it's going to happen in qualitative research. That data triangulation that is so important, because we do need to bring in, to some degree, multiple data sources and analysis too. And using those multiple methods to help strengthen the interpretation of the data are important as well. So these are some of the criteria that make qualitative data more sound and more universal. Now, gosh, qualitative researchers have to think conceptually all the time. Even, I mean, when they're out in the field and they're conducting the research and they're interpreting and looking at those diaries and logs and that verbatim transcript, they're constantly thinking about the meaning of the data. So it has to incubate. They have to gel on it and think about it. And I have attempted some qualitative research in looking at RN's values and use of the nursing care plan. And I can just tell you from experience, boy, that data is prolific. And really what I found was that RNs have high value for the nursing care plan. But at that time, there was very little use of, or identified use. But what they found was that, or what I found was that nurses value the use of the care plan, but that care plan, especially once you've become a seasoned RN, becomes second nature, and that you're using these care plans in practice, but you're not necessarily using the written care plan, which I found fascinating at the time. All right, interpretation of qualitative findings. Transferability, again, that is the extent to which qualitative findings can be transferred to other settings. And that is important because you do want to see what similar interpretive issues are out there. What works well or what you understand about one culture or people or group or individual may work well for another. And then there's this thing called the thick description. And what this basically means is that transferability really cannot occur unless the thick description has occurred. And that thick description is a rich, thorough, and vivid description of every nuanced piece and particle of a study. So you can see that that might be no small feat. Isn't that interesting? Gosh, we love qualitative research, don't we? So this section may cause you to think just a little bit more. As we come to the end of the qualitative research focus and design, I hope you have a better understanding of how those processes, how it may look. And as you start to interpret these studies, I hope you will do well. And take care, and I will see you soon, nurses.